Okay.
Hello, Mr. Parvin. It's great to have you here in Vardiya, in Venice. I will give a brief introduction about you and your works, then we will keep on with your presentation. Thank you. Alastair Parvin is an architectural and strategic designer working with innovative London design firm 00. Although he trained in architecture, his work looks beyond the conventional framework for architecture, looking at the economic, social, political, operating systems behind it. He is co-founder of the Wiki House, an open-source construction set whose aim is to use digital manufacturing to make it possible for anyone to cheaply design, download, print, and assemble structures without the need for conventional construction skills and tools. The project is now being developed by a small community around the world, including a project in the favelas of Rio, which was awarded a TED City 2 prize in 2012. The Wiki House project pursues the idea of a 21st century urban development model where citizen and user production can shape cities. He has written for numerous journals and publications around the world and co-edits Makeshift, an open fanzine about architecture, society, economics, technology, and design. Thank you.
I don't anymore. Makeshift doesn't exist anymore. But anyway, cool. Yeah, so I'm going to speak for hopefully around 15 minutes. What I want to talk about, broadly speaking, is the economics of architecture in a nutshell, and why it is that we have developed countries have housing crises. It's obviously one of the kind of blind spots of particularly the architecture discipline, you know, which, as you say, is where I come from originally, that we talk an awful lot about the design of cities, but we have a pretty poor understanding of the design of the systems that actually design cities, if you sort of mean the systems behind those things. So I'm going to do a screen share, and hopefully we'll be able to pull up some slides. Please shout if you can't see those slides. You'll have to forgive me. I'm going to, at various points, going to be talking a lot about UK statistics, but the story that I'm going to tell is a version of this story can be told in almost any developed and developing country right now. So the graph that you can see here, I would say this is not a blank page. It looks like a blank page. This is actually a graph, and it's a graph of who builds our homes, who builds our cities, and it's what you can see on the far left is a small, what's called a high peak, a tiny number of huge developers who in the UK, almost half the homes we build are built by just 10 companies. And then on the right hand side, you can see this long tail. So that's many, many small kind of players, such as local government, small developers, housing associations, and people building for themselves. And broadly speaking, the narrative of the 20th century has been all about the peak on the left and how to get the peak on the left to build more. And so that's an interesting graph to bear in mind. Another interesting graph to bear in mind is this. So this is a graph of the net wealth of the UK. And again, the UK is an extreme example to some extent of this. So this is a graph of everything that the UK owns, basically. And what you can see is that today, almost half of what the value of the UK's economy is actually land. It's the inflated value of land, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. In fact, land and buildings account for well over half. So what you can see is if we look back over the last few decades, since the 1990s, almost all of the actual economic growth in the UK economy wasn't in real assets like factories or things like that. It was in the inflating value of our property, of our land. And this isn't, of course, is not an unfamiliar story. Most metropolitan economies in the world today have, you know, an inflating a housing crisis driven by inflating land. And there's a huge amount of confusion as to why that is, basically, or what the causes are. In a nutshell, at risk of oversimplifying it, the drivers of that housing crisis was not, as it's often thought, an undersupply of housing, although there is often an undersupply of housing because of the huge scale of demand globally. I mean, I should say that globally, this is obviously a huge issue in the sense that the scale of urbanization between now and 2050, when you work out the maths, it's about the equivalent of building a city the size of London or New York every 5 weeks. Between now and 2050. So yes, there is a huge underlying demand, but actually most of that inflation came from not the undersupply of houses, but the oversupply of credit. So essentially the way it works is that if you are a household, you need a house by definition. A house needs land by definition. And so to buy that access to that piece of land, whether it's renting it or buying it, you need money. And so that money tends to come from mortgage lenders who lend money and give it to households in order to buy their homes. Another kind of really crucial piece of understanding that I think more and more people are now beginning to realize is that we tend to think of the banking system as being, we think the way that banks work is that they take savings in one end and then they make loans. They take that money and make loans at the other end. That isn't actually how the banking system works. The way that banking actually works is kind of terrifying, which is every time a bank creates a loan, they invent new money into existence. They create money and they hand it out as debt. So this was the system, but of course there were limitations on how much debt they could create, both regulatory limitations by the intrinsic end value of the property that they were going to be creating, which was limited originally by what people were earning. But what happened in the 1980s and 1990s is that there were massive deregulations in unlocking this, and computerization hit the banking sector. And so banks began to realize that what they could do is actually, when they lent money, they could lend out more money to people, so people have greater spending power on houses. So of course what happened is that they having more to spend on land, the value of land and property went up. And then a really, really weird thing happened where effectively they counted the increased inflated value of the land. So this kind of, they encountered the inflated value of the land as value to lend against. So in turn, they created even more money and handed out even more debt. And so then land and property prices went even more. And so the result was what we've seen in many, many developed countries, which is this escalating exponential explosion of property, real estate prices, and debt. So more and more people buying homes, but taking on greater and greater household debt. And so this, if you've seen the film Big Short, you know the story of kind of how this happened, where banks started kind of bundling up these debts and selling them on, et cetera, et cetera. But really, the important recognition is that this is the engine that has been behind pretty much all architecture and urbanism for the last few decades. So the model that's done through is it's got various words like current trader, but it's basically a model that's familiar to all of us. And it's worth kind of running through that. So let's take a piece of land. It doesn't really matter where it is. That has, say, is used for industrial use or agricultural use. Basically, the current idea is that a developer comes along, they buy that land, and they then fight their way. They get political permission, whether it be through legitimate means or by corrupt means, to get the permission to build homes on that land. And straight away, the value of that land inflates massively, and they get to capture that value. They then have to put infrastructure. They then get essentially one architect. They get one chunk of money to get one architect to design a whole neighborhood as one single monolithic project with one single chunk of money. And as I would say, the real law of architecture is not form follows function; it's form follows finance. And so the result is that you get one big monolithic building, right? One big monolithic neighborhood. Then we reconstruct those buildings, these incredibly inefficient and risky construction models. Then effectively what we end up with this. And then in some countries, of course, then the idea is that having let all this happen, the state then wants to try and tax back things like through what's called Section 106. So affordable housing and other community bits of infrastructure are sort of taxed back. So all these costs stack up for the developer. And of course, ultimately, they have to get profit on the top of it. Now, the issue is that, and this is the open secret of this model, is that what they are building and what you as an architect are designing it looks like a home, but in real economic terms, it's not a home. It's a financial asset to sell or to rent. And the price of that financial asset is defined by how much you can borrow. In other words, by the mortgage markets. So let's say in this area, that's deemed to be not 285,000, but 265,000. What's going to happen, right? The developer is not going to go, oh, you know what, we'll take a bit less profit, because they'd be fired by their shareholders if they did. What they'll do is cut down the build quality, or they will negotiate their way out of some of the community contributions, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the open sort of dark secret of architecture at the service of capital, as it has been throughout, the last few decades, which is that everything that we say is good about design and about the design of cities, which is, quality, generosity, sustainability, flexibility, to the people actually building our cities is actually a cost. It's a cost on the bottom line to be reduced. And so we find ourselves in these situations where actually we're building the lowest quality cities that we possibly can. And so that, certainly in the UK, we see that. Where the UK, we're building, I think, the second smallest homes in Europe still. And of course, that's not the worst. The worst bit is that these are really actually pretty dysfunctional neighborhoods. This is not a neighborhood where you start a business. This is not a neighborhood where you, know your neighbor and you look out for your neighbor. Essentially, this is kind of storage for humans, or at the more luxury end, it's like a permanent hotel for people in lots of debt. And some of them literally have concierges, in the bottom. So these are neighborhoods where you're totally dependent on external services to kind of keep the place going. So these are not, in the kind of Jane Jacobs sense, these are not prosperous neighborhoods. These are high debt value neighborhoods, but there's very, very few businesses going in here. It's just kind of pure consumption activity. And that's not a cartoon. This is actually what's being built. So, this could be anywhere. It could be China. It's not. This is actually the Olympic Village in East London. But this is China. And all around the world, what's happening is that this debt-driven real estate model is being used to build the cities of the future at an incredible scale. So this is a place called Kalamba Kiaxi in Angola, which was built in the continent of Africa. Driven by Chinese financial capital. What's weird about this place is they build it and then it sits, the whole sections of the city sit empty for years. And it's a kind of non-place. It's just these stacked up real estate, and they pay cleaners and gardeners to kind of look after it, which is really, really weird. And of course, I'm getting ahead here, but one of the interesting things, that there's this really hilarious moment where a BBC journalist interviewed some of the gardeners who were looking at this and said, oh, what do you think of it? And they were like, oh, it's great. This brand new city, it's great. There's no crime because there's no one there. And they said, well, oh, and which one is yours? Which house is yours? And they're like, no one lives here. I live here down the road. And this is increasing, or not even increasing, this is the future, is that actually the reality of the city, down the road, there's this other urbanism, which does work, actually isn't debt driven, but there's no infrastructure, there's no system supporting this. So you have this kind of weird paradox of these empty real estate cities, and then at the edges of these empty real estate cities, real cities in which the level of deprivation is incredibly high, the quality of infrastructure is very low, etc., etc. And of course, you know, this is a photo I took when I was over in Istanbul. You know, every country has their own version of this, and Turkey, of course, notably also has their own version of this story. And we saw this with the lira crisis in September. And that especially revealed the extent to which a lot of the development in Istanbul, a huge scale, was driven on this model. And then, of course, a lot of it froze and stalled, right, in the crisis. So this is deeply unsustainable debt-driven model of urbanism, primarily driven heavily by offshore finance. And you know, I was interested to read about Istanbul, that it turned out that a lot of the developments were actually funded in dollars, and even to the point where the construction companies were paying in dollars rather than in lira. And actually, what we're seeing across many areas is not just that this is bad urbanism, but actually it doesn't work. Like it simply isn't viable anymore. There isn't enough profit to be made. You know, projects are stalling, or the homes at the end are not affordable to end buyers. And beyond that, you know, this is before you even get to the long-term failure of these neighborhoods as places. So that's the model. The question is, why were we dependent on this model? Well, you know, there's a lot of reasons to do that, to do with financialization and global capital. But one of them is also the industrial assumption of the 20th century that the only scalable, regulatable model is the model on the left, the idea of few big centralized producers. The assumption was that the long tail of many small players is not scalable, it's not investable, it's not regulatable. You can't industrialize it. It's the word that often gets used is too damn difficult, you know, to lend into that space, to regulate it, etc., etc. And that is a question that we're really interested in, because that we see is an opportunity where digital technology can be quite transformative potentially. If we look at what the digital revolution has done in other sectors over the last couple of decades, has done exactly that. It has moved us from industries where production was centralized in the hands of a small number of very big organizations to one where the power of production, not necessarily the ownership, but the power of production was highly distributed into the hands of many. And what we think is now happening is that digital revolution is now coming into the built environment, into the way that we design and produce physical things. And that's what gets termed the fourth industrial revolution. So this is a kind of general sort of overview picture of the fourth industrial revolution. What's most interesting about this graph is that, from a political and social perspective, you can see here that the fourth industrial revolution looks most like the pre-industrial, actually. So we're potentially emerging out of this era of massive centralized top-down production, and that's obviously really interesting as to what the implications of that are for urbanism, for finance, for planning, etc. And that's really what we're working on. So where we started looking at that is with manufacturing. Is traditionally when we talk about manufacturing houses and buildings, we think of somewhere like this, a huge factory that costs millions of pounds to set up. And what we began to explore with the WikiHouse project was actually maybe the housing factory of the future could also look like this, right? A very small scale factory that you could set up in a garage, or maybe somewhere like this, a small business unit, which is this one is on the outskirts of London. And so that's what the WikiHouse project was about, right? The WikiHouse project was a building system that was designed to be manufactured in these small-scale factories. So I'm not going to talk too much about it, but as an example of what we call design for distributed manufacture and assembly, the idea that we could make a digital building system that can be designed like a kind of digital Lego, and then all of the components can be manufactured in a small-scale factory and assembled essentially like a kind of flat pack kit to millimeter precision, with very little skill. There are no architectural drawings as such involved in the assembly. It's just IKEA-style instructions that anyone can follow. So this is a video of a WikiHouse in a rural part of the UK being built. And the important thing I would say about this video is there are no construction professionals in it. This is just a farmer and their friends and some of us sort of volunteering. And they're building a house to absolute very, very low energy home to millimeter precision, with the main enclosure in a couple of weeks. And this is just one example of one material, one manufacturing thing, in one country. And sure, Wiki House is spreading to all kinds of different locations, and people are varying it. What we've been doing since is then going, well, if Wiki House is just one of many ways of doing this, the next layer down is building the digital operating system. So at the moment, we use CAD, offline CAD drawings, CAD systems. So this is a platform that is still very much a prototype at the moment. We've been developing. So what we're developing here are web-based parametric tools, so that we can architects and designers can write what we call patterns, and they can put them out there so that anyone could use an interface like this. It's running in the browser, where you're making very, very simple design requests, and in the background, algorithms are writing all the details. They're counting every screw. They're pulling on live data to estimate exactly how many bits of how much material will be needed, etc., etc. And so it's calculating the cost live. But we could also, the cool thing about doing this in the web is that we can also hook this up to any data set. So this could be hooked up to, for example, energy data that helps us predict what the energy performance of this house will be over its lifetime, almost instantaneously. So this is the sort of thing that traditionally you'd have to pay a consultant to do for hours and hours and hours. So the whole idea is we can use technology to make it as simple to design as we possibly can. And the key thing is that the rules are written by professionals, and they're baked into this model, so you can't go wrong. And actually, one of the projects that we're doing now is exploring this in the context of digital regulations. So we're actually working with local authorities to digitize planning codes, so that a model like this could actually be automatically checking itself against the regulations and giving you a green, orange, or red traffic light as you're designing by automatically checking itself against the codes. So I want to finish by sort of zooming back out, going, well, what are some of, that's just a very quick couple of examples of what digital technology could allow us to do. But if we exaggerate that out, what could that mean for really transforming the economics of the way that we produce cities? So the first thing is to say, well, actually, governments will begin to license their land much more carefully. So rather than just selling them to offshore speculators, governments have the power to take parcels of land and to lease them or sell them directly to the people who are going to live there at a very low price. What they can then do is, instead of going through a very corrupt planning system, essentially the community and the municipality can agree planning codes, essentially design rules that are very, very performance driven, that effectively say, look, these are the rules of development in this neighborhood, and as long as you stay within the rules, we don't need to hear from you. So it's a very, very scalable approach to regulation that's baked into a digital design code. Effectively then, selling off plots or renting plots directly to families and community groups and businesses who are going to live there. And then people can then sort of freely procure and build using a whole variety of digital, methods, like WikiHouse or 3D printed concrete or whatever it might be, whatever the industry is developing to make it as simple as possible to build high performance homes at that point. And of course, the really crucial thing about this is that what we're doing is not only keeping those costs incredibly low by taking away things like the land cost, but also, so you can see here a comparison between the kind of speculative model of development, which is deeply unaffordable, and this model of direct development, where you just get the land directly to people and make it simple for them to do it for themselves. But of course, you're building truly resilient, sustainable neighborhoods, because, as I always say, we all agree we need to build more low energy homes. The only people with an incentive to do that are the people who are going to live in those homes for the next 20 and 30 years and pay the heating bills. So until we close that loop, until we start seeing design and architecture in terms of the whole life value of a building, we will never ever build sustainable cities because no one has an economic incentive to do so otherwise. So this is really hugely, hugely important. And as always, I'm keen to point out, this is not a cartoon either, right? Every aspect of the model I have just described has been tried somewhere already. This is a well-known example in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And actually, I heard a while ago that a few years after it was built, because this was, quite a long time ago, it's quite a high-end version. It was quite a long time ago this neighborhood was done. The municipality recently did a survey of these streets, and they found an incredible number, like 400 registered small businesses within just a few streets. And that's the difference, right, of building cities that are truly sustainable, resilient, prosperous neighborhoods, as opposed to just these debt-driven stacks of real estate. So three big kind of lessons or takeaways, really, I think, are: one is there is a huge opportunity in digitizing, democratizing design and construction, which is actually putting the power and the tools directly into the hands of citizens and small businesses to build cities for ourselves. And that will have a huge difference. A second kind of massive transformation, I think, is in land, which is the shift from this late 20th century view of land as a speculative asset which can be sold to offshore investors to effectively extract rent out of our economies. More and more we will see governments begin to realize that land is the platform for a successful society and economy, and by controlling and licensing land directly to local businesses and local people, they'll be able to make very, very successful places compared to failing places. And then the third one, which is crucial, which is really the end goal of this, is to shift from this short-term investment in speculative real estate assets for the mortgage industry to, and this is the goal for architects. If we really want to be standing up for quality, as architects call it, it's finding ways to use data to transform the way that we invest in the built environment. So investing in the whole life performance of a home, because actually the build cost of a home in the first few months of its existence are actually dwarfed by, if you look over 25 years, by the running costs, by the energy costs, and then in turn even they are dwarfed by the public costs of health costs, policing costs, and the overall prosperity of the economy. At the moment, we are allowing the short-term cost to effectively disinvest in the long-term performance. So we're making neighborhoods which are designed to be the poorest quality that they can be. And actually what we'll begin to realize is if we can use data to allow investment into the whole life performance of buildings and into the whole life performance of neighborhoods and cities, actually we can begin to imagine a radically different relationship between capitalism and cities. And so I'll finish, as I often do, with the Jane Jacobs, who basically said everything I've just said in one line, which is this: cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, but only because and when they're created by everybody. If we essentially made that the objective of much all urban development policies and work backwards from there, we couldn't go that far wrong. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was, I guess, a really stunning presentation, because I guess every one of us was very interested in the economics of the future in architecture. We will go through a couple of questions, I guess. I guess everybody has something to ask here. And before I want to say I start, I would like to ask my friends who would like to start this questionnaire.
I can start.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Alastair. First of all, I want to thank you. It was really mind-opening. Also, it was really similar to us, and I really questioned about my working of field because I have worked in a structural company based on woods. So we were building wooden houses in a sound way. It's really cool part of it actually. I had seen so many similar things and also so many different things. But according to you, what is the difference between your methodology and our methodology? Maybe you know a bit understand. The normal structural companies, they don't work with to digitize the database. The architects design a very special building, like the first diagrams you see, show, and then we go there and construct it with wooden elements. But you start with you, but is it possible to be a very sustainable, creating a very sustainable and just changing the starting point as a great digitizing the design?
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing because what we have to kind of remember that construction has gone through a couple of phases. So the first era of construction was where design knowledge was in people's heads, right? So there weren't even drawings. It was just vernacular knowledge passed down from master builder to apprentice. And that hit its limit of complexity. So then we moved into this model of construction, which is essentially paper-based, right? Which is what most the architecture profession has mostly only ever really existed in that paper-based era. Where, as you say, it actually, when you think about it, it's a very backwards way of going about designing a building, because you start by saying, oh, this is what I want, and the architect produces a sketch, and then they hand it to someone else saying, here, work out, hand it to an engineer, say, here, work out if that will stand up. And then they pass it to someone else and say, work out what material that's made of. And then they pass that to someone else and say, well, work out what those materials cost. And then they pass it to someone else and say, well, work out how to put those materials together. And so there's this kind of, the architect at the beginning is designing completely in the dark. Like, you have no idea what things are going to cost, et cetera, which is really a problem, right? Because by the time your building has gone on through that journey, it looks nothing like what you were originally trying to achieve, and probably the cost has escalated beyond all imagining, which has then led to all these kind of really bad procurement practices, which are trying to control that risk. So really what digitization allows us to do is to flip that model on its head and to say, let's digitize all the knowledge that we as a society already have, and effectively standardize that knowledge into pre-worked out components, and then work with it. So from an architect's perspective, it's the difference between saying, here, draw something on a napkin, and then we'll let you know in a few months what it costs, to here's Lego. Every brick costs 50 cents. Now go and play with it and see what you'd like to do with it. Now, some people will say, oh, that's less creative. That you're restricting by pre-standardizing the components, you're restricting what the architect has to play with. I don't believe that's right, and I think the level of nuance that you can build and diversity you can build into those patterns and those components is actually there are two amazing roles for architecture and design in the future. One is in coming up with those components and being very inventive about them, and then the other one is then, you know, coming up with those different configurations of what you could play with them. But you're right, it's really, really interesting, because it's going to be and we've started this journey, but it's going to be a huge paradigm change in construction in the next few years, from designing a thing, then engineering it, and then procuring it, to flipping it the other way around, which is basically to start with the price and then start designing and engineering, and then just go, click, go. I can't hear you, sorry.
Okay. So this is really fantastic answer. Yeah, it made me start to think about the stakeholders. Actually, this is the main part of the issue, I think. So I want to say my words to the friends. Thank you so much.
I mean, and it is a general rule, by the way, that technology is never really about technology. Technology is just a way of changing humans' relationships with each other and the way that we organize ourselves in terms of knowledge and trust.
Okay, we will. Edith will ask something.
Okay. Hello. So we talked about like the necessity for a huge paradigm change in construction and how we approach architecture, and I'm curious about your thoughts on architecture pedagogy today and the future of architectural education. Like if students are to graduate with a set of skills that enable them to participate in this paradigm change, what do you think has to take place?
How long have you got? So to give a very, very short answer to that obviously very, very long question, and I'm sure you've got a lot of answers as well. I think the first thing we have to do is flip what we think the outcome of architectural education is. So basically, the way that our educational systems were created was backwards, in the sense that they said, right, we've got these big industrial systems, and now we need to staff them with these humans to run them. But we need to essentially it's like making this vast computer, and the components of that computer are humans. So you need to validate those humans and fill them full of knowledge, standardize repeatable knowledge, and then send them out there. And the way that you then controlled that was by giving them letters after their name to say, oh, you can trust this human. We've given them the knowledge. They know it. And so we created things like professions, essentially as proxies for knowledge and trust. And so basically, you know, for our parents' generation, and in fact, more recently than that, pretty much from my generation, when I turned up at architecture school, there was this very, very strong expectation that you were going to become an architect, and that you were going to go through this training and you would be checked and examined. And at the end, they would say, yep, you're good to become an architect and you can go and work out in the industry. Now, what was really interesting was that then, I think 2008 and the financial crisis really brought home to us that that was a complete load of rubbish. In the sense that we were being made for a future that it doesn't really exist. And even if it does exist, it's just working for real estate capital, right? And it's going to be transformed. So I think there are loads and loads of things that, about the sorts of skills that we need, about the you know, from the digital to the social, you know, to the kind of communication skills that we need. But I think that before we can get to any of that, we need to scrap the notion. Imagine that when you graduate architecture school, you're not allowed to become an architect. And instead, you go, right, you've got to go and use your design thinking to work on a particular problem. And then when you work out, design your way into that, now design what the business model of that solution is, now go and make a business. So I think that's one answer, is that actually we need to become much more flexible and much more entrepreneurial about where in the economy architecture intervenes, moving away from this idea of the architect as this person who sits at their desk waiting for wealthy clients to turn up and ask them to design buildings, to the idea that actually in the stack of the built environment, there's 1,000 different ways that somebody with design thinking can intervene. And some of those businesses probably don't exist yet, so that you will have to go out and create them. So I think that's the short answer to your question, is we need to kind of realize that there is not just one professional outcome to this way of thinking. There are thousands, and actually the future of architecture's business model is itself something that needs to be designed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a question that I have been trying to put together on my mind. I guess this way of making houses like IKEA style Civic Houses is a kind of flexible idea that is very much related to also cultural issues in the countries. It's like, I'm talking about vernacularity. you have any studies on them. And I don't believe this is only related to completely, this doesn't have to be only related to economics, but I believe as people, we always care about our cultural issues, and I guess vernacularity is very much related to this kind of housing. And did you ever thought of making studies all around the world and trying to gather information on putting up, building in this in vernacular way, because it's like reinventing a type of vernacular, I thought.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. You know, obviously Turkey is an interesting example because I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong on this, but for a long time Turkey had the concept of, is it Gecekondu? Have I got this right? Yeah, cool. Which is the notion that actually you have a right to build shelter, a subsistence right around the built environment. What we found as we're doing this project is that you know, that diagram I showed where the fourth industrial revolution looks a lot like the pre-industrial revolution. We're finding so many cultural and economic and social resonances between those two, and that keeps coming up again and again and again. Like, so for example, a lot of cultures, there isn't one in English, but a lot of cultures have a word which is in Finnish it's talkut. In I think Kenya it's harambe. In Norway it's called dugnad, which basically means but what we in English we'd call it barn raising or community work, where people come together and build something together in a day or two and then have a feast and then they go back to their work. So, and we, you know, this is all part of what we think, you know, the economy, we call it the citizen sector, to get governments to understand that not all work is done by the state or by businesses. Actually, citizens can produce as well. They do work as well. So it's hugely important. And actually, even in the kind of language of design knowledge, you know, I would say open source vernacular are really the same thing. It's just that we have these amazing tools now. We have the World Wide Web. So actually, take the example of the energy performance of a building. For the last half century, in hot countries, the solution to energy has been pretty much build a concrete box and bolt some air conditioning on the side. And of course, this consumes huge amounts of electricity. But actually, if you go back further in, you know, further in time, you will find that the local vernacular architectures contained a bunch of super smart, what we call design patterns, that had really clever passive climate control solutions. And so actually often one of the first things is, as we're moving back towards the capacity to have a more knowledge intensive relationship with our built environment, actually one of the first things you can do is go back to that original pattern, work out the science behind it, and then dust it off and re-pick up where we left off. So I think there is a feeling like, you know, an optimistic version of this feeling is that actually maybe we will look back on these 20th century industrial systems as a very clumsy adolescent period of human development, and actually like we can now have all the benefits of industrialization, but without that clumsiness, with a much more knowledge intensive relationship. And this will apply in farming, etc., etc., etc. And we're actually finding that even in the software there's a resonance here. So a very well-known book was written by a guy called Christopher Alexander in the 1960s, 70s. He actually wrote three. There's The Timeless Way of Building and The Pattern Language, in which basically he studied vernacular cities and looked at the way that these design patterns, so commonly reoccurring pieces of design knowledge, which are open source cultural knowledge, the way that they evolve and get adapted to produce the most beautiful places that we all love today, like, you know, your classic Tuscan, you know, Tuscan hillside town or whatever. So and what was really interesting is that that book wasn't very popular with architects. Architects hated it because architects all thought they were artists. They hated the idea that there were patterns. whereas it was hugely influential in America in the early coding movement. Well, I mean, early, but, you know, sort of in that era, the kind of the coders in Silicon Valley. So that book was very, very influential in shaping a lot of the coding languages and frameworks that we use today. And so we always like to think that at Open Systems Lab, a lot of the work we're doing is actually just kind of borrowing back. So yeah, there's this really interesting element of Back to the Future about this, of leapfrogging. We obviously are a small organization. We are prototyping, so we don't just stop and do research. We don't have the resources to just do the research. I think it would be really fascinating for more people to really dive deep on that research. But as we're working and as we're prototyping, that is obviously, these are the thoughts we're thinking all the time.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating Back to the Future answer, because when we say vernacular, when we study, it's like really going back to the future. And I was going to mention just after we discussed about ornament and crime, like I guess this is also related to this conversation, and I have a small question that is more practical. I'm sorry that I'm interrupting my friends, and I was just going to ask maybe briefly if you could explain how do you see the land use in the future inside these economies? Like,
that's a small question. Again, that is actually a very long question. We've been working very hard on this. I'm going to hopefully publish a short paper which we've written soon on a concept of affordable land. So one of the aspects of this is that we think governments are going to need to move beyond this 1990s idea of affordable housing, which is really a bollocks, frankly. It's increasingly meaningless term, towards this idea of affordable land. Effectively, you know, I touched on it when I was speaking. The big shift is, do we see the land beneath our feet as a speculative asset which we sell to the very wealthy and effectively allow them to extract what's called economic rent? And, you know, the go-to person to study on this is Henry George. Effectively, one of the great I'm sure you guys are familiar with the board game Monopoly, right? Yeah.
yeah.
So that game was actually, it has an interesting story. It was invented as a cautionary tale. It was invented to warn us. I mean, it backfired really badly, but it was invented to warn us that allowing rich people just to extract money for nothing, because the value from land, a piece of land in the middle of Istanbul is worth more than a piece of land outside the city, but the land is no different. It's just the location, right? And the owner of that land didn't do anything to deserve that, right? The value, the location is to do with schools and infrastructure and jobs and businesses, etc., etc. So there's this perversity in our economy where we've locked ourselves into this mindset where we see land as an asset to be traded and sold. And actually, this is one of the difficult issues in this globalization versus nationalism debate, which is that, of course, a lot of the time in countries like the UK, and as we've seen in Turkey, we're allowing offshore investors to effectively buy the land beneath our feet and then take away 30% of our monthly income every month, you know, in rent. So there's a big paradigm change, and it won't happen suddenly, it won't happen overnight, but I think what will happen is that governments will begin to realize that there are other ways to treat land as a platform and keep land at a low cost. If you want to have a high productivity, low cost, high well-being economy, one of the smartest things you can do is keep land values low. Now, some people argue for things like land value taxes. We are looking at more incremental strategies for how governments can slowly test and transition from one to the other without kind of shocking their economies too hard. And one of those is this concept of affordable land, which is effectively a way that governments would effectively they would sell leaseholds on land. So they would lease land at a very low rent. You could only sell the land for the same amount you bought it for. In other words, you can't capture speculation on that land. So it's a piece of land that's available for you to build a home on and to live on, but you don't get to make money off the land. You just get to live there. And so I think there are new, and again, this is something that as an architect, you can be thinking about, you can be designing. And if anybody tells you in your architecture school, oh, that's not architecture, tell them, no, it's more useful than that, right? It doesn't matter whether they want to call it architecture or not.
Thank you very much. I leave the words to my friend.
Okay, hello. First of all, by the way, thank you. You mentioned the rules written by professionals. It's really, I think, moving statement here. And there is a huge concern today. Who is the designer? Architects working as a creator nowadays, or where is the data? Who is creating the data? So, what's your opinion on in the near future? What if the machine learning makes the optimized decision for the according to inhabitants' conditions instead of themselves? So maybe it's way better in terms of budget and time. And I know I'm an architect, but probably architects kill me. But I guess it's it's the best. We have to be prepared for our near future for at least this rules part, maybe already related by commission. So, thank you.
Yeah, this is a really good question. We don't know exactly the answer to this question, but the one answer we can do is we don't need to be scared really about this. At least we don't have to be scared for ourselves. We have to be scared for the world maybe, but not scared for ourselves, in the sense that there are two ways of seeing design or a designer, right? You can see design and architect as a profession, i.e. somebody who gets paid to do something, which it has been for a very short period of history. Or you can see design as a way of thinking that is something that humans as a species are much better at design than all other species. And we've been doing that forever, right? And that's never ever going to go away, right? So the formulation of this is going to change, but this isn't. So the real question is, well, where is design thinking needed in this future digital economy? As a rule of thumb, digitization simply means nobody gets to be paid to solve the same problem over and over and over again, right? Which is good news for architects, because it means not sitting there with unpaid CAD monkeys or redrawing details that have been drawn hundreds of times before, right? It's taking repetitive components over the work out of the work. But yeah, as algorithms become more sophisticated, and as we start to feed data into those algorithms to make where the line between patterns and machine learning begins to kind of really advance those, more and more of that becomes pattern and rules based. There is still always someone, I'm always quoting Cedric Price, technology is the answer, but what is the question? There's always somebody who needs to ask the question and keep asking the question. If the algorithms are owned by a company that's closing those algorithms down, there's going to need to be someone who's saying, by the way, that's a problem and here's why. So there's a huge number of ways in which architects need to be involved in both doing the work, doing the work that isn't yet done by algorithms, which is the synthetic thinking about the questions in particular and people in place, but equally keeping the algorithms and holding those algorithms to account. So effectively, this is really, really exciting, I think, as a designer, because if you come up with a particular design pattern that, let's say, you come up with a mechanism for a house that can completely is like perfect. It can, let's say, it can process it can process sewage, right? So it can process human waste. Now, if you can now publish that solution as a pattern, as a series of if this, then that, and build an evidence base behind it, now other people can adopt that. And that design solution, instead of designing buildings one by one by one by one, which is what architects currently do, that pattern can then be replicated around the world. This has huge implications, though, which we are working on, but we don't know the answers as to liability. And part of the work that we're doing as we're exploring platforms like BuildX is not thinking just about the technology, but also about the licensing and business model. So although we open source a lot of our hardware technology like WikiHouse, we actually want to make sure that as an architect, as a designer, when you license a pattern out to a design pattern like that out to the world, actually small contributions do come back every time it's used. So there is a healthy business model in many people in a diverse ecosystem coming up with design patterns, improving them, providing an evidence base, checking them, coming up with better design patterns. That, for me, is a much more appealing version of this algorithm AI future, or machine learning future, than a kind of model where we sit here and wait for Google to do it for us, with one server in one country.
Fine answer. Oh, thank you very much, by the way. It's very satisfying answer. It's really good because there was 20 years already. 20 years ago, this is the same question for the CAD and CAM already. Architects already scared for, are we losing our designer skills? Computers takes everything from us, but no. Now machine learning doing the same, and I think 20 years later maybe there will be another question. But always we are scared of something before we see the consequences or the how can I say, the bad sides, or the the time is really important and nowadays for us, and this is the best way. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I thoroughly agree with that. And every time someone says that to you, I have a couple of stock answers, which I always give when people say that, and you take these and use them as well. Every time someone says that to them, you've got two answers. One, at the moment, architecture is already unemployed, in the sense that architecture as a discipline is estimated to be responsible for something like 2% of the built environment, right? So if we want to make even the smallest dent on climate change and these big social issues like urbanization, we cannot do it with our current model. We are already unemployed, right? So that's the kind of first thing. The second thing is that, okay, so if we've got to find a way to kind of scale up, like, I go back to the thing I mentioned before, which is that if you work out the scale of urbanization between now and 2050, it's a city the size of New York every 5 weeks. And by the way, that city has to be zero carbon, right? No civilization on Earth has ever pulled off anything like this. We have to not only, it's not like we have a good working model now and we have to ramp it up and scale it up. We've got to reinvent our model and then scale it up rapidly. So now we can do that if we shift from our mindset from, oh, we're going to build houses for everyone and put them in debt, to, oh, we're going to create the tools for everybody to build houses for themselves and build local, prosperous, sustainable green economies. We can do it, but it's a huge challenge. The notion that anybody is going to run out of jobs anytime soon is laughable, right? But yeah, equally, we shouldn't be glib about automation. The real challenge of automation is actually the ownership of automation, right? The challenge is the relationship between technology and capitalism. It's not the technology itself. So long before the robots come and, sort of start harming people, the business model of the humans will come and start harming people. So I think this is by far we should not be scared of technology. We absolutely need it if we're going to take on the vastness of the challenge that lies in front of us. But equally, we do need to look to governments and look to civic entrepreneurs and the way that we invest to build to build AI, I don't really believe there is such a thing as AI, to build machine learning algorithms in such a way that we don't create these big technology monopolies, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not, yeah, I think Stephen Hawking, the physicist, before he died, he had a thing like this where he came out and said, oh, AI is the scariest thing we face. And then about a month or two later, he came out and said, correction, the ownership of AI is the scariest thing that we face. And I think that's really crucial.
Thank you, Mr. Parvin. Before we keep on with our friends' questions, I'm sorry again. We have from anonymous the people who are watching this broadcast, we had an interesting question that asks, building the cities ourselves implies a community and methods of knowledge exchange, in who's asking's opinion. How important is it to design and develop these platforms on which the know-how can be shared? Is it within the responsibilities of the architects?
Well, I mean, you can probably predict my answer to that is it's crazy important, and forget whose responsibility it is. Like, we should just do it, right? And this is also the difference is shifting from this view of, oh, I'm an architect, so that's not my job, to I'm a citizen, that needs doing, so I'll just start. Like, instead of sitting here and waiting for a Silicon Valley company to do it. Now, and that's what we did. Like, you know, I trained as an architect. We realized this problem needs solving. And so now we're trying to work on some of these platforms for, you know, exactly as the questioner puts very articulately, for effectively knowledge exchange. That's, you know, and like, what's weird is that I think people are scared to think, oh, I can't code. I don't understand technology. I'll leave it to somebody else. It's just start and you'll learn. But bring with it a different, you know, a different mindset. Actually, a lot of the technology that we're developing, we're really surprised that Silicon Valley hasn't already developed all of this. And actually, one of the reasons they haven't, although bits of it, you know, there are companies working on it, but one of the reasons that they haven't is because they have a different question of technology, which is generally they want to just make money, whereas we're driven by trying to make technology because we understand the question that we're trying to solve with it. So, and then later down the line, we go, okay, we should probably give this thing a business model, and we're working out, you know, we're working on that. So yeah, I think that's the answer. It's crazy important. And actually, as a society, one of the challenges that we face is changing both our attitudes to technology, as in technology is not just a private sector thing that the tech industry is going to come and do to us. Technology, digital technology, is the pond in which we all swim in now. We're replacing paper with digital technology, and all of us must learn to participate and lead in that world. You can lead that world, just start. But the other bigger question is then changing the way that we invest in technology, because at the moment there is not enough investment into these sorts of platforms. You know, of course I would say this, but you know, there is not enough investment given how crucial they are, and you know, what a huge business opportunity they are, frankly.
Now, Eda has a question for you.
Hi, I want to ask and learn a little bit about the social aspects. Okay, the social aspects and social concerns of yours and also the Wiki House, because that kind of self-built method is also used mainly on post-disaster areas to raise the sense of belonging between communities. So people are building their own homes and they feel that much related because they're contracting it. And it's the kind of relation that they create between themselves and their dwellings. So have you ever experienced that kind of relation in society that you're intended to be creating, and the reaction of people in your own operations due to the Wiki House?
You mean resistance to it, or?
No, I mean, like, have you ever concerned about raising the sense of belonging with this operation?
Well, I mean, there's two things on this. So, I don't believe there's any such thing as social architecture. All architecture is social, right? And so every time you participate in a system, it has some social impact, right? The current system of architecture and development, which is very much, we're going to build you a box, and then you're going to move in, and there you are, bye, and you don't know who your neighbor is pretty antisocial, actually. And there's been lots written, on that. One of the things that we found through the early process of the WikiHouse project is, and again, this goes back to the thing we were talking about before about the Back to the Future leapfrogging aspect of this, is that actually on the early WikiHouse pilot projects, one of the jokes we often make is that actually at the end of the project you could knock down the house at the end and it wouldn't matter. You've actually achieved what you need to achieve, which is you haven't built a house, you've built capacity, you've built community, you've built a group of people or a group of businesses who now know how to build a house anytime they want to. And that's actually more valuable than a house. And we see this again and again in, I could tell 1,000 stories about WikiHouse builds of how when you start doing this, when people hear their neighbor is building a house, they either come and complain about the noise or they come over with cake. Or they say, oh, can I join in? And so there's this really amazing things where the process of building the house becomes the process of building these relationships. And that's not a kind of woolly, soft thing. It's a very, very real thing, because we then realize that that's why it's really important that WikiHouse is mistake-proof, because the people who are building their homes and allowing volunteers and friends to help build their homes, they were very nervous, because they were nervous that they wouldn't build their house properly. It's really, so if you end up at the end of the day where the house that they've built together is rubbish, then the owner has lost money and needs to knock that house down. But equally, their friend has given some time and they've burned their social relationships. So that's where actually we take a very, very hard-nosed attitude towards making sure that we've made it mistake-proof enough so that at the end of the day, you can guarantee that no matter what the building level of skill that those people have, they can go back at the end of the day, oh, look, we built a really fantastic house together. Let's have a drink together. And actually, you're building relationships. And then often, as I say, where people are doing more, they set up a local factory. And so they end up with not just a few houses, but a few houses plus a factory, which employs a few people. And then they go and manufacture other stuff as well. So I think that is I mean, I don't know if I've managed to successfully understand and answer your question, but that's sort of what we've begun to find. Our general attitude towards this, though, is this idea that there is no such thing as social architecture. Everything that we don't think that WikiHouse is going to become, all housing. It's just one experiment. It's one building system. It's one project. But what we're always trying to do is we're never happy if we think it's just a kind of marginal boutique thing, like something that's only for poor people or only for rich people. Like, we're always trying to prototype what could be the new normal.
Thanks.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Parvin, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Good night, man.
Thank you.